I'm so happy to have you with us, kind of returning the favor you had me on your show for Growth Masters.
That was an awesome episode. Really enjoyed that conversation.
So tell me a little bit more about yourself. How did you get started into all of this?
Yeah, thinking about that question makes me feel a little bit old. I got started programming really young, which I think is kind of common in our industry. I started copying programs from magazines into my Atari 800. Carlos, did you have an early computer? Did you come up through the engineering track at all, or how did you get started?
I studied computer science, but definitely didn't even have a computer when I started.
Yeah, this whole era of like tape drives and like using magazines to enter in programs and stuff, it's just stretched such a nostalgic chord for me. But so I did all that stuff, and then when I was 12, I started to program for companies. My first real job in tech happened when I was 17, working for Acer America. And that's really the start of my career. And things really went from there. And I've learned new things at every company I've been at, whether it's small ones, and I've started a few of those as well, to some of the world's biggest companies like HP, Walmart, and Google. And, I started very much from engineering, but when I think about my start in product, I didn't even really think about what hat I wore for the whole first early phase of my career. I don't even really think there were that many hats. I think people just made software, and you kind of did it all. And it was kind of fun. And it was really in the early 2000s that I first ran into a product manager type person. I remember, Carlos, I was so puzzled by this person who spent all of his time in PowerPoint and would kind of draw UIs in PowerPoint. I didn't really understand it at the time. I came to really respect him and the role that he played. And in my own career, it wasn't until around 2013 that I moved into a product-ish role when I formally moved over to kind of a CPO-like role at Walmart. Whereas the head of, we called it global product, I ran product management, design, and front-end engineering for all of their global e-commerce stuff. And then I oversaw product and design in various roles at Google. So that's kind of how I got my start. And just kind of one final thing to say there, I really owe, kind of reflecting on it, I really owe my whole career to a couple of mentors that I had very early on who just took me under their wing and also gave me a lot of opportunities when I got started. Anyway, that's a little bit about how I got started.
Did you have to make any PowerPoints for the transition?
There was one role where I did do some UI mockups in Apple Keynote back in the day, but yeah, generally not a whole lot of product design in PowerPoint.
And what brought you to Segment, and kind of give us an idea of the size of the business?
Yeah, I spent a lot of time thinking about data privacy in my final year and change at Google. I was on the work stream that worked on Google's web strategy with privacy, and just from that perspective, I came to know Segment. And initially, I got to know Segment just sort of to understand the space that they were in and their perspectives, because they were at the center of a lot of different data issues and a lot of companies handling data. And as I got to know the problem space in the team, I really fell in love with it, and that led me here. And when you look at Segment, Segment's really been in this whole space of customer data from close to the beginning. Really, more like 7-8 years ago is when the company started. Kind of, I don't know, Carlos, if you remember this era, but most of us, I think, had instrumented our applications or web apps once with like Google Analytics or maybe Omniture. And then there's a whole wave of tools that started to hit. And I think we all sort of had this reaction of like, we're not going to re-instrument every time we want to add a new tool. And Segment was at the right place at the right time with this open source thing called Analytics.js that solved this problem where you just instrument with this one library. When I say instrument, I mean just send event calls with this one library whenever your customer did something. And then it would just fan it out to different tools. And first, Segment did this all on the client. But then over time, we built out server-side offerings, and today it's this big platform where you send events to the server, where they're then processed, and you have governance rules you can layer on top of it to comply with regulation, and then they're routed to destination tools. And more recently, Segment's sort of moved a notch up the value chain, where we've thought really hard about how people are using this data, and really usually in service of personalizing the experience that you offer customers. And we're thinking more and more about how we can help that. And that's really more of our focus now, helping you build these rich profiles of your users so that you can then integrate that with the tools that you use to customize experiences based on your users' behavior, all in the context of first-party data, because of this contract that all the regulations in code where you can use the customer behavior data to improve the quality of the services that you offer. Anyway, a little bit about segment what drew me to it.
It's fascinating because all of these things that you are talking about now that somehow sound, like accessible to a lot of companies wasn't really the case back in the day. I remember integrating with Google Analytics was amazing. Like seeing a map with where their users are visiting was already like a huge accomplishment.
Yeah.
And of course, like large organizations would have access to build their own infrastructure, but being able to democratize access to data and connect it to different tools in an agnostic way, it's something that for me as a product manager, when I was working as a PM before, it was, a breakthrough.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think more and more, it's interesting to think about where this is all headed, because I do think helping you understand what all this data means is super key. And I'm really fascinated to see more and more how forward-thinking teams are automating these sort of loops that happen when you can take this data and then actually take action on it, and then feed all that back in and refine the action you take. So it's exciting times, Carlos.
I think also as picking back on what you said about PMs, and I think that now having access to a lot of tools that don't require an extremely technical expertise allows more people think about product and focus on the business and design side of things. Yeah. I think before it was like a big misconception around like you have to be a very strong engineer before you become a PM, and that can be the case, but that's definitely not the only pathway.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's like sometimes I feel a little confused at just how many tools are entering the market in every single vertical. It's kind of amazing. Every time I turn around, I feel like, whoa, there's like 3 where yesterday there was 1. But the like you were saying, what I love about all of this innovation is that it is generally trending in this direction of of building out these layers on top of the problems we're solving, so that you can get closer and closer to the value. And the sort of infrastructure skills, I'm just going to use that term to describe the sort of not really valuable skills that you needed in the past to just sort of figure out how to configure all these things and figure out domain specific ways of expressing your intent, are all kind of melting away, and the tool chains are bringing us closer and closer to the value. And however this plays out, what I loved about Segment is that it's right at the center of all this, because if you don't have good customer data, then you can't take advantage of all these tools. You don't have a foundation to build on. And so it struck me that the company's position was just really interesting and really strong.
So one of the things that are very common here in Silicon Valley is, as a PM, you have to fall in love with the problem and not with the solution. Where are you at in that statement? And particularly, are there any problems that you are particularly passionate about?
I think that's a great framing. Yeah, I think just the whole problem space of like how you can make it easy to get the data that you need to, and then to figure out how to integrate and get value out of it is an interesting problem. And just to sort of zoom into part of it, let's talk about collection of data, because like there's this common pattern that I've seen in almost every company I've worked at in the past 10 years, where as a product team, you want to understand exactly what's happening with your product. So you want to have all these events generated throughout the product, but like it's gotten ever more sophisticated. So really you need a data science team oftentimes to make sense of the schemata that you want to use for the collection of data, and to coordinate that across all the other product teams, because oftentimes you're in an enterprise with lots of other products and you need to keep those consistent. Then you've got the engineering team that actually writes the code, and keeping this triad in sync can just be a huge pain. And so that's just one of the problems in this space that I really love trying to solve. And we actually have a few different solutions that reflect different bets we're making. We recently launched something called Visual Tagger, which enables you to do some of the instrumentation visually. So it puts the power in the hands of the data team or the product team. And we're also rolling out dynamic instrumentation, which lets the data science team or even the product team really construct the instrumentation on the server and then have that dynamically deployed to the client without having the engineering team have to get involved. And we're about halfway towards that journey. And so we're trying out different solutions to try to figure out how to get to solve that problem of how you can cut through the coordination difficulties of having all these teams have to work together towards the same end, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, you've seen different product teams across different industries and company sizes. So in your experience, what are some of the biggest misconceptions in product management?
That's a good question. I think the Steve Jobs one is maybe like 2 levels deep now, the cliche. I think the first cliche used to be that the PM was the CEO of the product in a way that really, I think, conjured up images of Steve Jobs, someone who was just really authoritative and insisted on their vision and dictated demands to the team. And I think we've all kind of moved on, and now the cliche is that that's the wrong model. And I think almost everyone will tell you that it's a misconception to be the CEO of the product. I really think the right answer is kind of in between, because I do think the best PMs feel really strong ownership of their product. And there's a really great Twitter thread a few days ago from Shreyas Doshi. Do you follow Shreyas Doshi on Twitter? If not, you should. He's a founding PM at Stripe, and he's emerged over the past few months as one of the voices that I find most insightful on Twitter. Anyway, he had this great thread about how the best PMs are the combination of high talent and high agency. I thought this was an interesting way of talking about ownership. What he meant by high agency is that you just have this really burning sense of ownership that you will get it done and that you won't make excuses. Not in like the sense of like I'm going to bowl over people, but that the buck stops with you to get results. And so I think it's really about the PM feeling the sense of ownership and not playing the role of dictator, but really orchestrating the outcomes from the data, from input from the team, from other stakeholders. And as you go through and make sense of all of this and prioritize all of this signal and synthesize it, that you're transparent about the process that you go through and bring everybody along. I think maybe the other misconception is that there's a single job called PM in the industry, because in my experience, PM roles look very different from company to company. I don't know, Carlos, if you've experienced this, but like, I think usually you have this thread in common where the PMs are the people who prioritize. And if you're doing the wrong things, that someone with the PM title is ultimately the person you should talk to. But then there's all these other facets, like does the PM do the research or do they partner with a UX research team? How much technical knowledge do they have? And some PM roles almost feel like technical architect roles in terms of how into the nitty gritty the PM is, whereas others it's very high level. Does the PM groom the backlog, or does that fall to a tech lead or an eng manager? Is the PM a visionary, or are they handed the vision, and so forth? And I mean, even like some PMs are chasing PMF and constantly iterating, whereas others find themselves iterating on a very mature product, which feels just very different in terms of the flow that you go through. And then at Google, I felt like so much of our role was internal stakeholder negotiations, and you'd spend a really long time, because when you have over 1 billion users for some of the products and all these other businesses that flow through the product, like Chrome, which was the most recent one I worked on, it felt a lot like, instead of ready, aim, fire, or ready, fire, aim, it felt a lot like ready, aim, fire kind of emotion. And so I think because the jobs are so all over the map for folks that are, and maybe I'm rambling a little bit, Carlos, but just to bring this one to a close, I think for PMs who are looking for their next role or to break into the industry, I think it's really important to understand that PM jobs can be very different. And then to get to know the target company that you're working with and understand how they PM, spend time with who your peers would be, and really come to a clear understanding. Because I think you can learn something from anywhere, but I think you really want to be clear on what you want to spend your time doing and get into a PM environment that works the way that you think you're going to grow the most, if all that makes sense.
I agree. And I think that's some of the questions that you were throwing out there are something that I wish I had answers for when I was starting my career. I studied engineering, and I just knew that I didn't want to spend the rest of my life coding. That's literally all I knew about my options. And as you start digging deeper and building things, you realize that there are many others. And obviously that was the ultimate inspiration for me to then start the product school 10 years after working in product. And we still had to provide a lot of clarity to people, because especially when we started, product management, I think, is fairly understood, and there's a lot of hype around it. Like everyone thinks it's super cool. I think sometimes maybe even overstated. They don't really understand the amount of grind that goes behind the scenes. But anyway, and we had to start from the basics, kind of defining the difference between product management and project management, or what is the role in product when you are a very small company versus when you are, more of like a politician, almost trying to put everyone in on the same page. So it's evolving. Even today, like now I see a lot of fragmentation within the product team. I think a lot of people think that, the only way you can work in product is as a product manager. But we see, the evolution of product growth, product operations, product marketing, product design, almost too many products. Like sometimes I look at LinkedIn and it's hard for me to know who is who.
Yeah. Oh, that's right. It is so different. Like even now, we were talking before the call, and you've met our recent hire, the VP of product marketing, and the role that we have for product marketing here at Segment's very different than the role of product marketing we had at Google and the teams I worked on. And so it's so fascinating to see that, like, we think we're using the same terms. Even product operations, we had product operations at Google, but it's different than product operations in most other companies. So it's still a bit nascent, isn't it, our industry? And things are still kind of coming together.
Mm-hmm. And I want to talk about your own personal growth, because as you grow, especially in Segment, when you join, I don't know how big the company, but I'm sure you guys have been in hyper growth mode. So probably even the own product team or the products that you have are looking very different from the ones that you saw when you joined. So how do you personally invest in yourself and block time to learn?
Good question. This may sound a little bit weird, but I think the most impactful learning I do is this habit that I started with COVID and the quarantine, which has taken on kind of ritualistic, sacred terms in my life, where every morning I get up, usually around like 5:30, and just frankly, because I can't sleep any longer than that with the world we're in. I don't. That's another topic we could discuss. But for whatever reason, 5:30, I'm up, and I go to this park that's just a block away, and I use the time to really introspect and write in my journal. And every day I spend, if it's a busy day, maybe just 10 minutes. If it's less busy, 20, 25 minutes, and really reflect on usually my mistakes and introspect that and figure out what I'm going to do differently, and just sort of reason through just what's happening in my life. And that time to be able to process and reflect has been super valuable for me, especially as I've accrued it over time. So that's one of the things that I think really helps me learn. In a more traditional sense, lately I've been studying corporate strategy and product strategy topics. Maybe the most impactful thing that I've read along those lines is 7 Powers. Have you read the 7 Powers book?
No, I hadn't.
Almost sounds like a multi-level marketing or maybe a cult type book, but it's really good. And it's a book by this guy, I think Hamilton Hemmer. And what he's done is he's built a model that basically his assertion is, if you're trying to build a company that's going to create lasting value over some period of time, that you have to understand how you're going to navigate your competitors with one of 7 strategies. And he represents that his set of 7 strategies are comprehensive. And by the way, I should say that this book's endorsed by a bunch of people here in the Valley, Reed Hastings and a bunch of others who have represented that they've made it sort of the core curriculum of their strategy processes. But anyway, Hamilton asserts that you've got these 7 processes, these 7 strategies. And if you're not using one of these 7 against your competitors, then you don't actually have a strategy for creating lasting value, that you're exposed and your margins will likely collapse and you won't be able to create lasting value. It's a powerful assertion, and the endorsements around it are also really powerful. And examples of these strategies include things like achieving market scale, achieving economies of scale, building a powerful brand, switching costs, and so forth. And it's really a fun book because it's so accessible and so easy to understand, but it also has a lot of math and sort of formal economic proofs. Anyway, sorry to rattle so long on it, but I found it to be really thought-provoking. Another thing to talk about is like making time. In terms of making time, I don't know that I have super insightful habits here. I just have a weekly backlog that I build, that I go through. I do that at a week level, not a daily level, because I find that's the sweet spot for me on time investment in the plan. And I just build and study opportunities throughout the week that make sense. So probably a lot of people do that. But the thing that's really helped me out is Audible, and just using every moment of passive time, like doing chores, errands, brushing my teeth, to get through a book. And I find I can get through 2 or 3 books a month at 1.5 times speed. And that's been really great at opening up time that I normally wouldn't have to get through a lot of books.
I think that 1.5x speed is incredible. It changed my life.
Oh, awesome. So you're an audiobook fan?
I'm not. I mean, I try here and there, but I'm a big podcast consumer, and I like to listen to podcasts on 1.5x. I find it much useful for my own
Yeah.
style.
Yeah. Oh, very cool.
And another thing that I found interesting is I think that when you are reading a book because you want to learn, it's not just because your parents push you to or your instructor push you to read a book just to get credits. It's a very different approach, and I like that much more than before. I look back at my student life and I'm thinking, oh my God, when I was in business school, I had a sales strategy class, but I wasn't thinking about any of that back in the day. So
Yeah.
I almost don't remember. And now when I look at a book, because I'm specifically trying to learn about sales in this case or whatever it is, I just want to eat it.
Yeah.
And I think that attitude with what you face, whatever challenge, it's everything.
Oh yeah, for sure. And like, I think the older I get too, you talk about eating up a book. Like, I remember when I was very young, I read How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. And he talked a bit about how, if you want to be entertained, you can read the book and it's entertaining. But if you want to actually get anything out of the book, you're going to have to read it multiple times. You're going to have to break it down. You're going to have to study it. And it really blew my mind at the time. And there are only a handful of books that I can do that with. But I love that process, like you were saying, of really breaking down a book and actually making it part of your personality, of who you are, by studying it deliberately and studying the passages that are most impactful by repeating your sort of having some sort of a study system that you use to go back and review those. And Seven Powers is the book that I've done that the most recently with, of just we actually had a formal study group where we went through it and took the time to really go through the concepts and restate them. Anyway, I love that process of deliberately learning, not because you're forced to in school, but because you have a reason to apply it. And I find that to be very satisfying.
Ultimately, I think that I believe in lifelong learning, and I just don't understand why a lot of, like, someone told us that you have to study until your mid-20s, then you start working and you cannot do anything else.
Yeah.
Well, what if you can do both? What if you can get to choose what you want to learn on your own terms, in your own format, whatever it is? And I think these days there are no excuses. Most of the resources are free. They're out there. It's on us to actually.
It's near and dear to my heart, Carlos. I'm so happy to hear you talking about it. Like, I use a program called Mental Case, which is just a flashcard program. I've used it for years to go through and deliberately study the things that I want to have in retention. And I almost started a company around lifelong learning about 5 years ago, with a concept of an application that could really be your sort of second brain. And I've been really intrigued to see some of these products come to market. I haven't found one that I really like yet, other than Mental Case, which is just a flashcard app. But I think, when I look back in the 60s and 70s with the writings of Vannevar Bush and others who really thought about computers as ways of augmenting our mental faculties, I think there's something in that concept that hasn't really been fully brought to life that would help us with lifelong learning. And hopefully a product that really hits that concept comes to market over the next few years. If not, maybe I'll revisit that and make a go of it. But it's definitely something I'm passionate about.
Now they also say that you have, especially when you're in your startup phase or in your before product market fit phase, you have to do things that don't scale. It's kind of the way to scale and do things yourself. But obviously, as you grow, there are certain things that you have to automate and you also have to delegate. So is there anything that you still do yourself directly because it's so core to your values, and you, even though it doesn't scale, you still want to spend time on?
Yeah. Oh, that's a great question. I think my guilty pleasure is programming, which was so funny when you said what you did earlier about not enjoying it. For me, I still have a latent addiction to programming. And sometimes I kind of question my life decisions about why I don't program all day, every day. But I look for opportunities to do that wherever I can, usually not in production code. But in terms of from a product perspective, being creative is the thing that gives me, I think, the most professional joy. This whole act of taking a problem, pulling in all the data that I can about it from different sources, and brainstorming creative solutions, looking for those that hit that sweet spot between novelty and impact and practicality. And when you lead product teams, that's not, at least I don't see that as the leader's primary role, because I think anytime I spend dreaming up solutions, it's probably not super high leverage, because I better not know more about my subdomains than my team and the leaf nodes on the team. And if I sort of drop in and feel like I have better ideas in the team who've been struggling with the problem for a few months, I think something's wrong. Certainly with a different perspective, you can nudge people, but that's a little different than what I'm talking about. So I do look for opportunities where I can indulge this, where I can really be creative at the right level. And I think for me, that outlet now comes in how I can take the plans of the team and translate them into a really compelling narrative that excites both the rest of the organization and my product teams and also our customers. And that's really where I try to get that outlet. I think some product leaders have teams that, especially when you scale up to a big organization, you'll have like teams that put this stuff together, but that's an area that I really personally love a great deal and try to spend time on.
I'm curious about your leadership style. Like, how do you balance the influence that you want to have over certain products with obviously the influence that other product people in your organization need to have? And in general, like, how do you like to lead your organizations?
Oh, this is a great question because it's on my mind a lot too right now. Because I think if I look at my last two roles, they were managing really senior people. And when you manage senior orgs, especially cross-functional orgs, or you sort of are on top of different functions, you're really at a high level in terms of being focused on the strategy and the outcomes you want the teams to drive and just reinforcing those messages. And coming to Segment, where I'm actually focused on PM, it's been really fun to sort of get a sense of the differences that are required for this role compared to my last roles. And the team here is incredibly customer focused, super talents dense, but it's also smaller and more focused on the one function. So it's been a bit of an iterative process for me to figure out what this job is versus my other jobs. And it's meant sort of shifting from more of that high level sort of goals and outcome focus, which is still important, to being more prescriptive about specific initiatives that are really important for the team, and especially looking across the different units of the team, figuring out how to balance the investment across all those, and just generally being at a new sort of lower level of detail, which is fun. But it's also something I'm iterating to figure out what the right level really is. And the core function, I think, here is, in terms of roadmap planning, figuring out the right level of detail that I want to get into as far as figuring out what initiatives we want to tackle as a team and just getting that balance right. And I can't say I have the right answer, but it's something that I'm constantly tweaking as we go through different planning processes and cycles quarter to quarter.
One thing that I also want to discuss with you is about product stack. Like, as you mentioned at the very beginning, back in the day, there weren't really that many tools built for product teams, at least as the main user persona. We were almost piggybacking on other people's or teams' tools, PowerPoint's an example, spreadsheets, and many others. Now we've seen this extreme wave of, I would say, no-code or low-code tools that are really easy to use for non-technical people, for business people, and can really give you a lot of power, but it's also overwhelming sometimes because you don't know how to start. So what do you think are some good practices for maybe people who are trying to get their data right and build their own stack?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to have a clear owner in the organization of the event plan, of your schemata for getting data out of your experiences. And when that doesn't happen, things descend into chaos pretty quickly, because you can have inconsistent implementations of the same sort of event types. You can have the implementations just be flat out wrong from the teams. And so when this happens, it just becomes really, really difficult as an organization to make progress, especially as you scale. As people leave teams and move on to other teams, as all of a sudden you have leaders who are thinking across different product teams, if you can't get that unified, coherent view, it's so difficult. So whatever tools you layer onto it, I think that's the piece that is just really, really important, creating that plan and being clear on who owns that plan. And at Segment, we have Google Sheet templates that we recommend to people. We also have our own product that we've built for this called Protocols. Whether you use your own sort of Google Sheets or Protocols or something else, that role has to be really, it's critical that you nail that role. Otherwise, I think you're going to struggle to get any kind of value out of your data.
And I guess that you guys drink your own champagne and get your own data through Segment.
Yeah. No, we have a really big initiative on Segment, and we were using our stuff. And This is one where, I mean, to be transparent, we've also shot ourselves in the foot, where we were so busy building our products that we didn't focus on using our product at an earlier phase of our company, and we put a lot of effort into it. And that's part of the reason why I know how painful it is to like migrate from an unclean situation to a clean situation. And then we've worked with tons of companies going through this process too.
And so then what are other tools as part of your product stack?
Oh, that's a great question. In terms of like using the data, I mean, we use a ton of products. We use mixed panel amplitude, Snowflake, Looker, Mode, all of that stuff. In terms of individual PM productivity, we actually love Figma. Like, I think we look for opportunities to misuse Figma. We actually do like birthday cards for the team using Figma and things like that, but we use it for a ton. Loom is catching on big time. Just this notion of creating like these video, like encapsulated videos we can pass around, which is really cool. We use Full Story combined with Zoom to get audio transcripts, Paper, G Suite, Airtable, starting to use Tetra. So we definitely use a ton. I love the fact that we're at this stage of life where we can play with tools that in a larger company are harder to use. And we definitely take advantage of as many as we can.
And ditto on Figma, by the way.
It's so great.
So just to wrap it up, let's talk about the future. What do you think are the biggest opportunities for people in product?
Oh, great question. I think there's one lesson that the world can teach us, just thinking like broadly. It's the value of feedback loops. And I mean, just look at the two of us and how humans have unfolded on our planet at the macro level. When you look at the micro level and just how much complexity there is in cellular reproduction or even just DNA replication, and you realize that all of that is built on a very simple fitness function, whether or not an organization is able to reproduce or not, and feedback loops that are pretty effective on that lead to. And so when you realize that this is the mechanism that we use in order to evolve things to get better, including products, I get really excited about how we can speed up that loop. And I think the past decade, as we've just been talking about, has seen lots of advancements in the collection of data and all these tools to make sense of it. And that's been really great. But I hope we see more and more moving forward opportunities to optimize all these aspects of product evolution and growth. And I think the past 4 or 5 years have seen a lot of forward-thinking, cutting-edge teams automate growth campaigns more and more, at least parts of growth campaigns, where you can automatically define either audiences or other ways of segmenting users and then automatically generate different campaigns that you then test dynamically and feed it back in. And I'd love to see PM automate more and more of the processes that we put in place. We'll never automate ourselves out of a job. There's just too much creativity and judgment required. But I'm just fascinated with how much more of this we can do. And just thinking about the integrations with Segment Zapier and tools like it are very popular integrations. And we see lots of people who are creating aspects of this. And I hope more and more we can get to this mindset of really reducing the amount of time in these feedback loops so that we can do better and better at creating better and better products.
Ben, it's been great catching up with you and learning more from you. So thank you so much for your time. Is there anything else you would like to add?
No, Carlos, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity. Wonderful to see you again. And I look forward to keeping up with everything you're doing at Product School. Thank you so much for what you're doing for the PM community.
Thank you. Bye.
Awesome. See you later, Carlos.